Welcome to Funny, They Don't Look Jewish, where Judaism appears in the panels. Our purpose is to find characters and stories and issues of comics that explore explicitly Jewish content. I'm Henry Bernstein.
And I'm Brandon Bernstein.
No relation. Hello, Brandon.
Hello, Henry.
I think I've said this now a couple times. We're back.
We are back. We have returned. Happy Friday.
We were in the Marvel Universe for a while with Kitty Pryde. That was a really exciting couple episodes.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to journey through her evolution and see that. And I feel like we stumbled upon some really good realizations about writers and how they impacted. But we keep bouncing back and forth, and we are bouncing back to the world of DC, back into your home field advantage, Henry. So who are we looking at today?
We are looking at Ragman.
Who is Ragman?
A character from the DC Comics universe. I would say probably a C-level superhero. Like if Batman and Superman are A, then you have like Green Arrow, Hawkman, Atom, B, and those guys might even be a 2A. Ragman is definitely C or D.
I feel like he might be a D-level hero.
So Rory Regan, he's a character that Robert Kanigher and Joe Kubert created in 1976. These are both comic legends. Kubert has done everything in DC and Marvel. Kanigher was a very successful Silver Age writer, writing Wonder Woman and Flash and some other very well-known DC comics. He's created as a Batman-style vigilante. He is in Gotham City, where Batman lives. Not sure why they need another hero.
It's a big city, Henry. I mean, New York in the Marvel Universe needs almost all of them. So
That's true.
Gotham can afford to have two.
That's true. They do have the entire Bat family.
Yeah, there's all these different, right? Isn't it like there's different boroughs of Gotham City that they each have? So I guess Ragman is just in the slums of Gotham City.
Right, which I think later in the movies retconned to what's called the Narrows.
Right.
And then the comics adapted that, but that's for another time. He wears a suit of rags. In his original origin in 1976, they're rags from the junk shop he shared with his dad. And he first appears in a 5-issue miniseries from 76 to 77, and he fought crime in the poorer parts of Gotham City, and his targets were often mobsters, gangsters.
Henry, you said he was created in 1976, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that make him canonically and chronologically our first Jewish superhero, given that Shadowcat wasn't created till the 80s and Thing wasn't revealed as officially Jewish until 2002?
Actually, no. In 1976, Rory Regan, who is the secret identity of Ragman, was originally Irish, not Jewish.
Oh, so what happened there?
Well, in 1991, the series was retold, or a new series came out, and in that he was reimagined, or retconned, as we like to say, as a Jewish character. But originally, in that original run by Kanigher and Kubert, who are Jewish, he was considered Irish.
So that's so strange. We both took a look at selections from a little book called From Krakow to Krypton, Jews and Comic Books, written by an Arie Kaplan. And in that, they interviewed Joe Kubert, and it says, from the 70s, the decision to make the character Jewish was a mutual one. Quoting Kubert, "We created him with a Jewish heritage, although we didn't make a big to-do about it." It sounds like they made such little to-do about it that nobody knew he was Jewish. So I don't know what to do with this. Either the facts in this book are wrong, or Ragman was Jewish only inside in the DC editorial office, and nobody, because everything I've read, everything I've looked at said Ragman from the 70s was Irish, not Jewish. Irish, not Jewish.
And that would go along with what we've said before about all these Jewish creators creating characters that seem to be specifically not Jewish. This is back to our original premise, why I wanted to do this podcast. And so that would make sense that they, in their hearts, thought of him as Jewish. Like, you can always speculate, we've talked about it before, that Siegel and Shuster maybe imagined Superman as the Moses story, not the Jesus story, but it was never said explicitly. And so that leaves open to interpretation. So maybe DC Editorial, who, by the way, was Julius Schwartz, maybe didn't want this character. Like, guys, just leave it alone. We'll make him Irish.
Right, or it's like what happens in TV in the Seinfeld of the 90s. Everyone knows they're Jewish, but they never talk about being Jewish. It's a known thing. And, it makes me wonder if this character is actually created to be coded as Jewish, sort of similar to Thing growing up on the Yancey Street that we saw, looking a little bit similar to the Lower East Side of New York, when there are Jews who are not at the higher level of economic status, right? The truth is that, as we said, Rory Regan, he is a ragman, and his father owns a junk shop, so this is clearly not a well-to-do family that's coming out. And it led to me asking myself, is there any relationship between Judaism or Jews and rags? And what I actually found out was that in 1555, on July 14th, Pope Paul IV issued a papal bull, which is a type of public decree that the Pope can give out. And this particular papal bull is called Comnimus Absurdum, which, strange name, but it comes from the first line, which is translated as follows: "Since it is absurd and utterly inconvenient that the Jews, who through their own fault were condemned by God to eternal slavery," and on and on. So clearly this is at a time when Catholic-Jewish relations are not so good. Basically, this decree revokes the rights of the Jewish community, establishes a ghetto in Rome, so the Rome ghetto is established, and it limits all Jews to only be able to get jobs in unskilled manual labor, things like being a fishmonger, or a pawnbroker, or a ragman, meaning someone who goes around and collects rags.
And then later they come to this country and get into the schmata business.
Exactly.
My grandfather would say.
Oh, thank God he's not schmata man.
Yeah. I would so read a schmata man.
I mean, yes, I would too, but I would not take it seriously in the least.
Right.
Well, what say we dive into what we're looking at today, Henry? So, usually we're looking at various different stories over time. Today's going to be a little different. We are diving into the 1991 8-issue Ragman limited series pretty much in its entirety, because I've got to say, Henry, I don't know if we've ever had a series that has had quite as much Judaism interwoven through it. Now, whether or not that's quality Judaism, we'll discuss, we'll leave that open, but I just want to say, from issue 1 through 8, almost every issue has a little something that is Jewish.
Yeah, definitely there's a little something. This series debuted in October 1991. Cover artists were Pat Broderick. Writers were Robert Loren Fleming and Keith Giffen, famous Justice League writer from the 1980s. Inker Pat Broderick. Colorists Anthony Tolin, letterer Albert de Guzman, and editors Kevin Dooley and Andy Helfer.
Great. So let's just dive in and start going through issue by issue. There's a few where we just need to say one or two things, and then there's a couple issues that we're going to require closer examination. So right away in our first issue, which is called Bones of the Defenseless, on page 11, we see a mobster named Howard Spratt has sent thugs to beat up Rory Regan, beat up his father Jerry, and in fact kill his father Jerry, and they toss Rory into an alley. And in the first panel on page 11, there's a voice in the narration that seems to be calling Rory Emmett, like the name, E-M-M-E-T-T. Then the second panel is pure black, and the third panel, we get this yellow scratch writing on the black, and now it says Emmet, E-M-E-T, as in the Hebrew word for truth. And next page, Rory is having a flashback to Vietnam because at the time he's a Vietnam War veteran. But in this weird dreamlike flashback, it's both Vietnam and also the Warsaw Ghetto. And in the ghetto, this large clay, brick-like figure is approaching him that it's revealed later on turns out to be a golem. And on the last panel of the page, clearly inscribed into the golem's forehead is again the word Emet. Now, of course, it's fully in English. It's not in the Hebrew letters, but I don't know what else we could want from 1991. It's pretty cool that that's there.
That's pretty good. And I just noticed one thing he says right before that last panel of the word Emet on the golem's forehead. He says, "This is no dream." And I just like, do you think that's a reference to Herzl or
oh,
the Big
wow,
Lebowski?
right. The Herzl quote, of course, being, "If you will it, it is no dream." I don't know. It's at least a fun coincidence in a rhyming, if not intentional. Another rhyming that goes on, established very early in the series, is the ties between the golem and the Ragman. Because on page 13, in the middle panel, you see Rory's helmet from the war. And now, in black font written on the helmet, is also the word Emet. After which Rory tumbles into the rags. So we just had this weird fever dream-like psychedelic surreal experience with all this Jewish imagery just sort of stuffed in there that will become more clear as the series goes on. But I've got to say, when I was first reading this first issue, I just was sort of amazed and so intrigued and loving the way that they were just tying in these bits and pieces, a golem and the Warsaw Ghetto, and I was definitely asking myself, how is this all going to connect? It's so cool how this is done.
Yeah, definitely.
Page 15 of this issue, as we said, Jerry Regan, his father, has died. And here's where we get to the bit I most want to talk about. The bottom of the page, the middle panel, we see Rory leaves a small rock on the tombstone, saying in narration, "I place a small rock on the tombstone before leaving my father's earthly remains." Yeah, it's so cool to see that ritual of placing not flowers but a stone on a grave. Henry, anything you want to say about this?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, it's super cool that the other thread we've seen in comics for Jewish stuff besides Holocaust and Hanukkah is Jewish funeral practice and Jewish cemetery practice, which arguably, at least to me, is one of the most meaningful areas in which I always feel like, man, Judaism just got this right. So it's just nice to see positive portrayals of death, frankly, in a Jewish context and accurately. So I just like that we and now that's been a thread in Ragman, as we'll see going forward.
Very much so. So let's dive into issue number 2, A Ragged Revenge, in which Rory first experiences being Ragman. We're going to start in the middle of the issue on page 16. Now, on the page before this, Ragman is fighting a bunch of the mob goons, and he finds a guy named Vorst, who's working for Howard Spratt, that mob boss, and he's holding Vorst on the roof, and Vorst goes, "I didn't do anything, and if I did, then I'm sorry." At which point Ragman tosses him off the roof to his death. This is no Batman.
Jeez.
So on page 16, the narration reads, "The dying man's final words give me pause. He said that he was sorry. Of course, it doesn't count. True repentance requires acknowledgement of sin, and he knew not what he had done." I loved this.
Yeah, it's very timely. Right?
Very timely. We're recording this literally the day before Tisha B'Av, 2 days before we observe Tisha B'Av, the Jewish fast day and day of mourning that leads into the high holiday period and introspection. I just wanted to bring up and confirm that Jewish repentance, it does actually require acknowledgement of sin. In Maimonides' epic work, the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Tshuva 2:5, Maimonides says, "The penitent who confesses publicly is praiseworthy, and it is commendable for that person to let the public know their iniquities and to reveal the sins between themselves and their neighbors to others." So you're actually supposed to say it, and then Maimonides goes on to say that someone who's arrogant and doesn't reveal and actually say what their sins are, that's a person who covers their sins and shall not prosper. So Maimonides as backing is pretty good when it comes to Jewish tradition. yeah, I think most Jewish understandings of repentance are, you can't just say a blanket, I'm sorry for whatever I did. I mean, we apologize at the high holidays and say things like, if we sinned without realizing it, please let us be forgiven. But like, true repentance requires an awareness of the damage we caused.
Yeah, going to that person and that you wronged and apologizing and making amends.
Right, very much. And in this case, Vort, he doesn't even know that Ragman is Rory. He doesn't even know that he helped to kill this man's father. He has no idea what he's apologizing for. So it's very much not a proper repentance. And it also came across to me, by the way, as like he was just saying whatever it took to save his life. He was not going to change his ways. So page 23 of the second issue, we keep seeing the word Emmett actually appear within the rags. And at first I thought it was just an artistic choice to have that happen, but turns out Ragman can see it too.
There it is again, the Hebrew word for truth, Emet. But what does it mean? I've heard the legend of the golem, but I'm not a clay man with letters carved in my head, and I'm only flesh and blood.
Thankfully for the flesh and blood Rory Regan, at that moment, outside help comes because we get the debut of a brand new character who starts talking at the bottom of page 23 and is fully revealed on page 24. It is Rabbi Leibowitz showing up, claiming that he's there to teach Rory, that Rory is his apprentice. And we see, how do you describe this guy, Henry?
He looks like David Ben-Gurion with a yarmulke.
Oh, that's a really good take. Yeah. Because he's like bald except for these white tufts of hair that go out to the side, and he's wearing a very prominent black kippah.
Yeah. He looks Jewish.
He looks very Jewish, right? So Rabbi Leibowitz shows up, and now he's going to turn this series in a new direction. And here, Henry, is where we get to the first issue that really we just need to cover in depth. This is Ragman number 3, The Folktale. So we start off by getting to know Rabbi Leibowitz a little bit more. And the only way to describe his character is every annoying Jewish stereotype you've read in terms of the way he talks. Like, I'm very curious, Henry. He sprinkles a lot of boy chicks and Meshuggah and Yiddish in. I imagine this was very annoying for you.
Yeah, except that it was a whole issue of it, and with a character who is a rabbi and wearing a kippah the whole time. So it wasn't annoying in the way that, like, the other examples of Judaism are when someone says "oi," like the token Jewish guy. He was the subject of the issue.
Right. Okay, fair enough.
Do you want to describe the cover?
Yeah, that's a good idea before we dive in. So the cover is pretty spooky. What you basically have in the background, you have the famous gate saying Arbeit macht frei. You have like this barbed wire on the top. Now in front of the gate to Auschwitz, you just see this green cloak that is the Ragman cloak, and it's set up to look as spectral and eerie as possible with no face, just shadow and these white eyes. And then inside the cloaks, where you should see Ragman's body, is a picture of the Warsaw ghetto burning down. It is striking. And Henry, what's it say there on the cover?
The caption reads, "It is Warsaw 1941. The people call for a hero to save them, and the first Ragman emerges to battle an evil he cannot defeat."
Yeah. Chills, even though, and we'll talk about it inside, I'm pretty sure they got the year wrong. Otherwise, it's amazing. It's an incredible issue, and that's what we're going to get, everybody. We are going to find out, I'll just give the spoiler now, we're going to find out that Rory is not the first Ragman, that actually Ragman goes back quite a while, and his father was a Ragman during the Holocaust in the Warsaw Ghetto, which, going back to your point earlier, Henry, because this is part of a larger, significantly Jewish story, the fact it involves the Holocaust does not feel cliche and stereotypical the way it has in so many times where it's like that's the only thing that gets talked about. The Holocaust is a part of Jewish life, a part of Jewish history, a part of Jewish experience, interwoven in a patchwork sort of form with all the rest of the Jewish life we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't feel like it's the only go-to thing, like in the way that we mentioned Claremont had written some X-Men stories that it's like, okay, Holocaust or nothing, or it's just part of the story.
Yeah. All right. So page 3, we get a simplified for comic books version of the story of the Golem of Prague. Starts off by telling us about the Prague ghettos of the 16th century. Lets us know that this was a time of blood libel and pogroms, mentioning about the blood libel that the Jews were accused, quote, of using the blood of Christian children to bake Passover bread, which I'd rather they just said matzah, but I also understand in 1991, fine, it's speaking to a non-Jewish audience. I imagine they knew the word for matzah. They chose to make it more clear. It then moves into the story of what they call Rabbi Low, which is based historically on Rabbi Judah Low ben Betzalel, the famous Maharal of Prague. And Rabbi Leibowitz, who is our narrator, tells us, one man, Rabbi Low, was versed in Jewish mysticism and felt moved to retaliate. And then it shows the famous legend of Rabbi Low and the golem, of Rabbi Low forming a golem out of clay and carving the word Emet into the forehead.
In English.
In English, fine. Now, the thing that frustrates me the most is you see a panel of Rabbi Low reading a book called The Kabbalah.
I knew that would get you.
Oh my gosh. There's no such book as the Kabbalah. Kabbalah is an entire system of understanding, a mystical system of understanding Judaism, an inherited tradition. It is a wide range of things. It is no one book. The main book of Kabbalah is the Zohar. Obviously, I can go on a rant, and it's not surprising to you. I'll let you say something, and then I want to bring up what he probably should be reading.
I just want to make a case for this panel here. Perhaps Rabbi Low, since he was involved in mysticism very heavily and clearly had some influence in the spirit world in order to create a monster to protect the Jews, perhaps he himself absorbed all of Kabbalah that there was and wrote it down in a book that only he possessed.
I don't buy it.
Okay.
I don't buy it. You're stretching too far. Odds are what he should have been reading is a book called Sefer Yetzirah, which is the earliest extant text we have on Jewish sort of esotericism. Scholars date it likely to 2nd century CE. Now, the reality is Sefer Yetzirah, even though it has the Sfirot within it, it's not really Kabbalah. It predates Kabbalah, which from my perspective doesn't really start until the 13th century or so. In fact, it might really be more about mathematical systems or linguistic theory, but regardless, eventually it starts to detail how God created the world through words and through speech, and how you too, using the right words, could create things and create life, such as a golem. So odds are he should be reading Sefer Yetzirah. I realize that's very inside baseball, as it were, and a little deep, and I'm not surprised. Really annoys me when there's the Kabbalah, just like it annoys when people say, it says in the Midrash, which is this huge compilation of so many different things.
Yeah.
The interesting twist and wrinkle that our authors bring us here in Ragman number 3 is on page 4. Rabbi Leibowitz in his retelling acknowledges the golem is a soulless monster and really can't be trusted. And so they still want to protect her, but they decide they need a human with a soul and a conscience. And so a council of rabbis creates a living costume made out of rags that each generation they'll choose a champion, a human agent, to wear it and bring the powers to life. And rather than being defended by clay, the Jews will be defended by rags, which, by the way, once again, Rabbi Low is around in the 16th century. There's that edict I mentioned earlier, the papal bull, about Jews being limited in jobs. So the rags makes a lot of sense. On page 5, we get probably the creepiest twist, which is not only is the suit a patchwork of different rags, each rag is actually a soul of a different person who's been killed. It's made of the souls of the dead. Basically, there are people threatening the Jews. The ragman kills them and captures their souls and adds a new patch to itself. Sometimes Rory goes and converses with those souls. Let's jump ahead to page 7. Now there, the rabbi refers to Rory's father, Jerry Regan, as Jerzy Reganowitz, and actually says to Rory, Regan is a name fit for Jews? And so clearly the implication is that the name was changed when they came to America, and it's a very Polish name. And Rabbi Leibowitz says that the two of them lost touch after May 15th, 1943, in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happens in 1943. It begins in April, and the last day of the uprising is May 16th. So the implication is something happened the day before the uprising ended to cause the two to part. Page 8 gives us a beautiful splash page of Ragman overlooking a burning Warsaw ghetto. The narration lets us know that all but 70,000 Jews had been sent to concentration camps, meaning Jews of Poland and Warsaw, and this page now reimagines Ragman fighting alongside the resistance fighters of the ghetto. There's a nice little caption where it talks about it, and Rabbi Leibowitz says, "Forever disproving Hitler's theory of Jewish cowardice." So the narration lets us know that the Nazis set the ghetto on fire as a last-ditch effort, and it turns out fire is the rag suit's one weakness that the rabbis built in to be able to control it in case it ever overtook its wearer. Page 9, you see Ragman continuing to fight all these different Nazi soldiers, and the narration says, "Everywhere was the Ragman. He was the living symbol of the Jewish resistance," which, love that idea of, like, you know, his costume is a patchwork combination of all these things, and he is all these different Jews fighting together, like, as one. And basically the Nazis want to take out the Ragman, because, like, if we beat the Ragman, then all the Jews will fall. And then, Henry, would you be able to read on page 10?
The Nazi commander had it backwards. The Ragman had rallied the others. He had inspired them. Now he was fighting with them, not as their leader, but as the embodiment of that will to live, which is the essence of life. He was their hope. And once the battle was over, and the tides had clearly turned, he was needed elsewhere.
It's like, it's so devastating, because we know how the Warsaw Ghetto ends. The Jews do not win,
No.
right? So it's like, he gets out of there because it's a hopeless situation, basically.
And the last two panels, the rabbi says, a young rabbi says, "Go, Jerry, take flight, Boychik. Find others to protect, and may God go with you." And then he says, "L'chaim, Joyzy, to life."
Right. Don't stay here where there's death.
Yeah.
Go on to life.
This is an amazing thing to say, like, as the flames of, I mean, Holocaust is literally a fire, you know, as the flames of the Warsaw Ghetto are surrounding him, to say L'chaim. It's one of those moments that could be really cheesy, and it's nice, it's sweet.
Yeah, it strikes
and
a
hopeful.
What's not hopeful is what comes next on page 11, when the suit forces Jersey to leave, and the narration says, "It's a Ragman's duty to protect his people and to inspire hope. But there was no hope left in that place." It proceeds to let us know that all the Jews left in the Warsaw Ghetto were gathered up onto a train to Treblinka, but first the Nazis blow up the synagogue, and you see this explosion. And this is not made up for the comic. This is what really happened. The Great Synagogue of Warsaw opened on the 26th of September, 1878, which happened to be the 28th of Elul, 5638, so it opened just in time for Rosh Hashanah. It was meant to celebrate Rosh Hashanah in 1878. And on the 16th of May in 1943, the last day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, it was personally blown up by SS Brigadeführer Jürgen Stroop. And they took this historical reality of what happened and just completely interwove it with this fictional comic book character. And obviously, I just saw you shaking your head, Henry, in sort of frustration over, right, like blowing up a synagogue, and it clearly strikes us as this devastating thing. But I'm also just sort of in awe at the creativity and the usage of this with a superhero comic, and it very much feels respectful. I love the fact that they imagined a Jewish superhero in the Holocaust and acknowledged that it wouldn't have made a difference. Like, you could see the power fantasy, like a Quentin Tarantino movie, right, where it's like the Jews fight back and they kill all the Nazis and Hitler dies and nothing bad. And this is like, we can't, there's some evils that superheroes can't save us from. Right,
and of course, superheroes being involved in World War II are nothing new. The Superman and Wonder Woman in the 40s, were seen punching Hitler and fighting. And then, of course, the first issue of Captain America, he's literally punching Hitler.
Right.
But it's not like in those comic histories, the Nazis were defeated before they were able to do all the devastation. It's not like Superman went to the concentration camps liberating people. I mean, there is a comic in the 90s that deals with an alternate history where that somewhat happens.
Oh, I want to read that.
Yeah, it's cool.
Cool.
And it's John Bogdanov draws it in the style of Joe Shuster.
Oh, cool,
Yeah, it's really
cool.
But it's not like Captain America saved all the Jews. So it's like he helped defeat the Nazis, but it's sort of like that's a different. In comics, World War II is always separate from the Holocaust.
Right, and this very much makes it about the Holocaust, and the superheroes are always like the American heroes coming in and marching in. This is a Jewish hero from inside the ghetto.
Right.
That's pretty incredible. So, page 12, we move on to, this issue is just full of powerful images. This powerful splash page of a concentration camp, and it's just all these Jewish men and women with yellow stars prominent on their striped uniforms, standing behind this barbed wire.
Feels very authentic. I wonder if he's Jewish because like Matthew Broderick is Jewish. I don't know.
We've been talking about this. I don't know for a fact if any of these creators are Jewish. I feel like the scripter, Robert Fleming, I feel like he has to be. I have no idea about Keith Giffen, whether or not he's Jewish. I have no idea about Pat Broderick. It's strange. None of these are prominent Jewish creators that we'd think of. Page 13, Rabbi Leibowitz gives some of my favorite dialogue, and it's not a surprise I'm a rabbi, but he's reflecting on the destruction of the synagogue and everything horrible they did, and he says, what were they thinking of? Did they imagine they could kill God? He came with us on the trains. He was there in Treblinka. He was everywhere that we suffered. And while I don't like the usage of the masculine pronoun for God, we'll ignore that, 1991. But that idea, it's so beautiful that like God accompanies us into exile. God accompanies us in our suffering. God's not absent from the Holocaust. God's like right there, which obviously that also leads to the major theological challenges of the Holocaust of how could God have let this happen? And many people wiser than we have struggled with it. So we're not going to dive into it too far, I don't think. But it's such a beautiful, I love that the rabbi insists like, no, God was there with us. Blowing up that synagogue didn't do anything.
Yeah, and it also points out that how horrible the Nazis were, that they already killed all the Jews that were in the ghetto, and the ones that weren't were going to their deaths anyway, then just blowing up the synagogue, like what was the point,
It was symbolic, right? It was a symbolic, horrific thing, probably in the same way that the temple was desecrated in Maccabean time. It's unfortunately, yeah.
It is really weird on the next page that Rory is in bed naked while the rabbi is standing in his pajamas at the foot of his bed.
Yeah, so the rabbi comes to Rory. The rest of the issue takes like a sudden churn and leaves that story. And now the rabbi comes up to Rory in the middle of the night, wakes him up to be like,
No, he doesn't wake him up. Rory wakes up and sees the rabbi standing over his bed in his pajamas.
In the rabbi's defense, I would imagine that in the ghetto, in Treblinka, space was so uncommon that you kind of just did that. You didn't have privacy.
Right, but it's like, it's that vibe of like, I was watching you sleep.
Yeah, it's very creepy. It's
your
also
house guest, the rabbi was staying at your house, and he's watching you sleep.
He's watching you sleep, and then when you wake up, he says, "Did I mention I raised a new golem and that it may be coming to kill you?"
Oh, no big deal.
Silly me, I forgot. So yeah, page 15, you see Rabbi Leibowitz in a flashback creating a new golem. Rabbi Leibowitz's thought was because Rory's father had not continued to be Ragman ever since the Warsaw Ghetto, he was like, the Jews still need a protector, so I'm going to create a new golem. And on page 16, we once again have this beautiful image that's like a collage of the golem saving lives. And the narration says, and with each life saved, the creature becomes less of a monster and more of a man. And you see in the different images, he starts like very round and clay-like, and he gets more and more human-looking, which is awesome.
I just want to say, he is the most 90s looking golem ever. He's basically the Terminator.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, thank you.
100%. Yeah,
he's wearing a leather jacket. He's punching bad guys. But there is an awesome part right in the middle where there's a burning cross and he's lifting up a hooded KKK over his head.
Yeah.
Like, he's just kicking everyone's
Kicking the
butt.
silent warrior that cannot speak. The rabbi also says, "It is said that by the age of 40, each man has the face he deserves. In the golem's case, it was literally true." And at first I was like, oh, is this some Jewish thing that I was unaware of? Like, the idea of, like, by 40 you've grown into your face. It's a George Orwell quote.
Okay.
It's not at all.
That's funny.
And sometimes some people say it's by the age of 50, by the age of 40. He's just quoting that. But we're going to play with age a little bit later on in the series.
Well, I thought it was like he was like insulting, like the golem was really ugly or something. Like, you have a face for radio.
No.
I say on the podcast that we're recording.
Fair enough. No, he's saying it's like the idea is that, like, you grow into your face and the one you deserve, and the idea is because the golem was such a valiant protector of the people, it deserved to be more and more human looking.
Right, it's not that, like, he was a monster murderer, so he deserved to have an ugly face.
Right, yeah, very much not. Page 21, Rory has another dream about Vietnam. Once again, it's completely swirling back and forth between Vietnam and the golem, and he actually talks with the golem. And the issue ends on page 24. Very excitingly, Rory goes to Rabbi Leibowitz and says, "I'm ready, Rabbi. Teach me what I need to know." Ragman number 6, coming out in March 92, a titled Shreds. Right on the first page, Rabbi Leibowitz is interacting with a character we haven't mentioned yet, Betty Berg, who is a homeless woman that was friends with the Regan family. It's implied that Rory's father did a lot to help the people of the community. We haven't talked about this, but owning the pawn shop, the idea is that Rory's father would often buy things from people and give them a decent amount of money so that they could get by, and then sell it back to them, either like cheaper than they sold it for, but he never had intention of selling the things that really mattered to people. He was looking out and he really took care of these poor denizens of the ghetto or the narrows of Gotham. So Betty Berg is a homeless woman. She refers to herself as Betty Boig. And the rabbi and Betty are each having thoughts about each other. It's really interesting. Rabbi Leibowitz thinks, "She is a good woman, but she has never known the horrors of Treblinka." And Henry, would you read for us what Betty thinks to herself?
"He's an okay guy, but he ain't never lived on the streets."
I don't know why, I just liked this sort of them thinking the other doesn't understand. You know, it's almost comparative suffering, but I think it's really being used more to show, like, these two have more in common than they realize.
Yeah, like if this was a sitcom, eventually they would be locked overnight in a closet together and be arguing all night, but by the end they were in love.
Right, or best friends or
Yeah.
whatever it is. I would totally watch a Leibowitz and Betty Boy. All right, so issue number 6 is the climactic final battle. It's an interesting narrative move. For the most part in this issue, we're following the golem's narration. And one thing the series has done really well is established that the golem is fighting for its own life. That basically, now that there's both active, a ragman and a golem, there's only so much magic to go around. And one growing more powerful is causing the other to get weaker, and only one of them can really survive. And the golem wants to live, and he's honestly a sympathetic character. He's very sympathetic, and the souls of the criminals in Ragman's suit are kind of starting to corrupt Rory, and Ragman's actually becoming the villain. And it's a weird move that you're rooting for the golem. And the golem says in narration,
"For more than 40 years I was the protector. Now I am to be replaced. I was almost human, almost able to speak. I had very nearly earned the right to express myself. I had ideas of my own, feelings and desires. I had a face."
I found this fascinating, this idea that, like, the over 40 years is the point at which a golem would become human. I've never heard this before. I don't think any of the legends talk about a golem becoming human, but it's an interesting idea, and I was playing with it a little. 40 years is often used as, like, a generation, right? The Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years, so after a generation of existence, the golem is almost human, but he says a year or two more. So if it was 2 years, it'd be 42. And I was wondering, is there significance to 42 and 42 years? Now, 42 is significant as a number because there's a 42-lettered name of God, but that's not what we're talking about. So I did a little asking around, as I like to do. The one thing I found that I just want to bring up briefly is the Baal Shem Tov has a teaching that there were 42 journeys during that time the Israelites were in the wilderness, and that these 42 journeys reflect 42 phases of a person's life. And there's actually Rabbi Simon Jacobson of the Meaningful Life Center has this incredible blog where he goes through all 42 phases. And he says at the end, I want to read this quote, all the 42 journeys are about freeing ourselves and transcending the constraints and limitations, the Mitzrayim, of our material existence, which conceals the divine, subduing and sublimating the harsh wilderness of selfish existence, and discovering the promised land, a life of harmony between body and soul. And it really sounds like that's what the Golem is going for. I do not think that either of the authors of this book were apt students of the Besht. I don't think that they knew this, but I think it's a cool coincidence that that's what 42 could be. And on the other hand, maybe it's just that after the course of 42 years, the Golem will have done enough good to earn it. I don't know. On page 14, Ragman knocks the Golem's head straight off, like disconnects it from the body. This also felt Terminator-like, right? Because it doesn't stop Golem from moving around. It's like, it's made of, clay. It doesn't care. And Rory says to himself, the way to destroy a Golem is to erase the word on its forehead. Emet, the Hebrew word for truth. Erase the truth. And I just wanted to say, it's not quite that, right? In the actual Golem legend, it's not that you erase the word. It's that Emet is spelled Aleph, Mem, Taf.
And if you erase the letter Aleph, it becomes just the word Met, which means death or dead.
Right, it means dead. And so it's not erasing the truth, but it's shifting the word from truth, meaning the God of truth that gives life, to dead.
But a very cool interpretation. Which I had never heard before. If like you're erasing the truth. That's what kills the Golem. I have no problem with that, especially if they're going to go with the English.
Right. Yeah, it works very well for an English-speaking audience. And the Golem's body, the headless body, ends up yanking Ragman away to save the head. And the narration says,
"It is not so easy to erase the truth. There is power in the truth. The power of goodness."
And it's Golem's disembodied head thinking that in like a thought bubble while his headless body stands over him, which is just a cool
It's visual. A very cool flipped visual, very much so. By page 18, Betty Boyd has shown up and she convinces the Golem that its time is done, that it can't be fighting for its own life. It's very clear that Rory is turning more evil and that the Golem needs to give up its own life so that its goodness will transfer to Rory. And the Golem understands, and in this beautiful and poignant moment, the Golem finally speaks out loud.
Betty, I love you.
And it just crumbles. Oh. It gets me. It's very powerful. It earns its humanity right as it ends. It makes it like Moses, it doesn't quite make it into the promised land, right? It dies right before.
Yeah.
And then on page 19, Rory thinks to himself, all of the love has left the Golem and flooded into me, leaving me more powerful than I could ever have dreamed. And that also feels very Jewish to me, the idea that there's a power in love. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the Lord your God. It's all ultimately about love. Despite terrible stereotypes out there that the Old Testament or Jewish God is cruel, there's actually very clearly love at the core of Judaism. All right, and then the last thing we really have to say is in Ragman number 8. With the Golem defeated, with Rory's father fully avenged, Rabbi Leibowitz is leaving, and he's on a plane, and he's heading to Tel Aviv, and he thinks to himself, it has been a long journey. And he dies. Dies on his way to Israel. Dies on his way, presumably, to be buried there.
That is so sad and so beautiful, and yeah, like I didn't expect to connect to Rabbi Leibowitz, especially because when we started looking into it, it was like, oh, he had a lot of those like sort of annoying stereotypes, but it's just a sad concept for any character when you're, especially when you get invested 8 issues, like this poor guy doesn't make it to Israel, like he doesn't even seem that old throughout the book, and in 91, if he was a young adult during the Warsaw Ghetto, it's not like he would be that old.
No, but he's older, and it's interesting. I feel like I went through phases, right? Phase 1 was discovering that there was this miniseries and that there was a rabbi in it and being like, this is amazing!
Yes.
Phase 2 was being so frustrated by the sort of shallow, cheap characterization by just using Yiddish phrases. And then phase 3 has been, in examining it, coming to really appreciate the relationship he has with Rory and, like you said, the sort of sad tragedy of his life.
Yeah, good writing is good writing.
Yeah.
And, overall, I think this is a great miniseries that is very underrated, and I didn't love the art, but Keith Kiffin is a great writer, and with a long history at DC Comics, and if you're not drawn in by the 8th issue, you would have been gone a long time ago. And so, 8 issues is a lot. That's 8 months of storytelling. So, they got me. They pulled me in.
Yeah. I would say there were moments of real brilliance in this series. Like, I thought that it was very much a hidden gem. There were also moments of, frustrating characterization and things like that, as we discussed. But overall, it was really a fun story. And I really think, we spent the most time on issue number 3, and I think it's still one of my favorite issues to read. Like, it was a really powerful and interesting and well-written issue. I think the first half of these 8-issue series is stronger than the latter half, but overall I really enjoyed it. And I don't know, any other final thoughts about this 91 series?
I'm just curious what your, if you were gonna, now we've read a full series of Ragman, how would you rate this on like a 5-star scale of explicitly Jewish content?
Yeah. You know what? I'm torn between a 3.5 and a 4, and I'll tell you why. I think it has some of the most Jewish content we've seen. The Judaism is very clearly an important part of the legend of who Ragman is. I also really like that basically we've created this DC Jewish legacy character, right? Because the implication is that from the 1500s on, there's been a Ragman, right?
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
Yeah.
And then there's I don't want to say inaccuracies, but there are little things that are sort of done to make it more English reader palatable. That's sort of maybe it's just a symptom of the times. Like, I think if the same story was written in today, you could probably get away with keeping it a bit more in the Hebrew and a bit more Jewish and things like that.
Also, Rucka would probably be writing it.
Yeah, how incredible would that be? But it's pretty high. I was a little surprised to find that this obscure character named Ragman would end up winning my heart over in this way.
Early on, when we were researching just what to do for this show, he's up there on the list, and we're like, Ragman, come on, there can't be that much. And just to give you guys a peek inside, the behind the curtain, Brandon was texting me, oh, and in issue 3 it says this, and then there was this thing happened, and oh my God, this is a very Jewish character.
It was some of the most fun I've had researching, because I just went to Graham Cracker Comics in Lakeview, one of my favorite comic shops in the city, and I'm looking for the Ragman back issues, and I find physical copies, and I just start flipping through and being blown away, and like you said, sending you texts of this. And they only had issues 3 through 8, and I had to track down 1 and 2. And not only was it fun to do the research and to have that, but it brought me back to a feeling I haven't really had since I was a kid, which was going to different comic shops and trying to find these issues. Oh, they have this one, and this one has this one, and oh, I'm in this. I ended up buying some things online from Midtown Comics in New York to get delivered, but it was really fun assembling these issues as well as reading and discovering no one talks about the 91 Ragman series, whereas everyone talks about the issue where the Thing becomes Jewish. Everyone talks about the fact that Batwoman is Jewish.
Yeah.
I just had never heard anyone talk about this Ragman stuff, other than, yeah, he's Jewish. It was amazing.
Yeah, the other thing about like that feeling you have that you haven't had since you were a kid is like reading a comic book series for the first time, period. Not reading it for the first time with a lens of ... You know, in our case, reading those X-Men and Fantastic Four stories again, but looking for other things. This was reading something we know nothing about for the first time. You know, when was the last time that happened? You know, obviously there new stuff gets written all the time, but like, you generally at this age, if you're a comic book reader, you're sticking with what you've enjoyed all the way through since you were a kid and curious about new things here or there. But like, this is an old story, and reading a superhero that you just know a lot about was really exciting.
Great. I'm so glad to hear that. What also has nice Jewish content are a couple more DC comics that we're going to be looking at next time as we follow Ragman into the late 90s, into the mid-aughts, more or less, and into pretty recently, just in 2018, we'll be covering a whole bunch more Ragman on our next episode.
And for now, I'm Henry Bernstein.
I'm Brandon Bernstein.
No relation. You can follow us on Twitter at Jewish Comics Pod, on Facebook at facebook.com/Jewish Comics Pod, or you can email us at jewishcomicspodcast@gmail.com.